Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Johan Rockström about his new book, Big World, Small Planet, Abundance Within Planetary Boundaries. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. My name is Dr. Andrew Thompson. I'm an adjunct assistant professor of political science at the University of Waterloo and senior fellow here at the Centre for International Governance Innovation. Every week, we're joined by an expert in global governance, international public policy, or some other aspect of external affairs here to the studio in Waterloo. Today, my guest is Dr. Johan Rockström. He is a professor of environmental science at Stockholm University. He's also the director of the Stockholm Resilience Center, and he is the author of a brand new book, Big World, Small Planet, Abundance Within Planetary Boundaries. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Johan, I wonder if we might start by talking about resilience. What do you mean by this concept?
Well, I should start by saying that resilience is a concept that was born already in the 1970s, originally set out as a theory by Professor Buzz Holling, who then has contributed to develop the broad international research area around resilience thinking and resilience research. And in the very original definition of resilience, it was largely about robustness or persistency, basically the ability of a system, be it an engineered bridge or structure or an ecosystem, to take shocks without breaking.
Right.
So basically what we could say, the ability to remain in a stable state. Then over the years, we've started to recognize increasingly that resilience actually has two other attributes which are equally important. And the second part, not surprisingly, is the ability to adapt to change without changing structure or function. So you could think of a society or a financial system, a business or an ecosystem that stays in a state, takes a shock, but has the financial, the agency, the knowledge, the capacity to remain and take that shock without being knocked out of a state. And the third large dimension of resilience is if you are knocked out of your state, basically you cross a threshold and you get stuck in a poverty trap, or you go bankrupt, or you get an irreversible shift in terms of, for example, a collapse of an ecosystem, like loss of cod fisheries around Newfoundland, which occurred in the early 1990s. Right. The question is, what are the attributes of a system to be able to transform in a situation of crisis? And what we learn increasingly around both the adaptive capacity and transformative capacity is that you need diversity, redundancy, and very, very large networks of different capitals to be able to deal with those changes. So resilience is a concept that incorporates both persistency, so the ability to avoid breaking, adaptive capacity, and ability to transform in situations of crisis. We bundle these together to provide a very simple and large statement of what resilience is, which is your ability to deal with change and continue to develop. And that's at large what resilience is about.
And how does that inform your thinking about ideas like planetary boundaries or safe operating spaces?
Well, what's happened in parallel with resilience research advancing over the past 2-3 decades, which I should say at the heart means that we study dynamics of systems, recognizing that they can actually, over long periods of time, thanks to resilience, change very slowly, but then abruptly cross thresholds and irreversibly change state. So at the heart of resilience thinking, in understanding persistency, adaptive capacity, and transformations, is the recognition that systems can change in a non-linear way. Now, that research has been going on for a long time, largely at local systems. So studying, for example, how a clear water lake with very good fish catches under many, many decades on unsustainable management and nutrient pollution and overfishing suddenly tips over a threshold and gets stuck in a new state, which is the murky, anoxic state, which does not deliver to the economy. And in parallel, we've started to see so much evidence that the human pressures on the planet has risen exponentially over the last 50 years. And that this pressure has now come to a point where we can talk of humanity having entered a whole new geological epoch, the Anthropocene. We are now a dominant force of change on planet Earth, which means that we're starting to hit the ceiling of the biophysical capacity of the Earth system to support humanity in a stable way. And when you combine these two concepts of the empirical evidence of rising pressures at the planetary scale, which is very new, that we actually can change things at the planetary scale, and the resilience insight that you risk crossing thresholds that could lead to irreversible, potentially catastrophic changes. That's how resilience theory informs planetary boundary thinking. Because if we let's say if we had not thought of resilience, you could think of the planet, which is largely the way, by the way, we've been thinking about the planet, that it changes just incrementally and in a very static way. Then you could say, well, sure, we have some environmental problems, but things are changing very slowly, and we can therefore put a price on it, and we'll gradually find a substitute and solve problems like air pollution or chopping down forests or affecting climate. But with resilience theory, things changes dramatically, because it means that at a certain point along a trajectory of gradual negative change, you might cross a threshold that means you abruptly get a change, which would affect the entire state of the Earth system. So that's how resilience theory informs the very core of the planetary boundary framework, which is the big question to say, well, what are the environmental processes that regulates the stability of the Earth system, basically the desired state of the planet. And if we now need to recognize that resilience theory is correct, that there are tipping points in the Earth system along the control variables that regulates the stability of these environmental processes, where do you go beyond the boundary where you're likely to cross thresholds? And that's where we place the boundary. And the boundary position has the beauty that if science can inform humanity of where the boundaries are for the processes that regulates the desired state of the planet, that gives us a safe operating space within which we have a very high likelihood of being able to provide good development for humanity. But you go beyond a boundary, then resilience theory shows that you're likely to cross a threshold which could abruptly and irreversibly push the Earth system in a wrong direction. And I should just add a little technical key insight there, that what is it that causes a state shift? Well, it's always a shift in so-called feedbacks. So what we're always chasing, and what resilience research has shown us, is that what keeps a rainforest, or a clear water lake, or a permanent ice sheet, an ice sheet, is negative feedbacks. That doesn't sound like a very pedagogic term, but what it means is that the Earth system helps us by dampening, meaning that you get a negative feedback, meaning that, for example, if we disturb the climate system by emitting greenhouse gases, so we contribute to temperatures rising thanks to our concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. But the Earth system, when it's resilient, responds to this punch by a negative feedback, by dampening, and it does so very effectively by sequestering carbon in forests, by sequestering carbon dioxide in the ocean. This is a negative feedback. We love negative feedbacks. That's the best thing we have, because it's the planet being our best friend. Now, that is what keeps the system in a good state. When we push across the threshold, what makes it a tipping point is that the feedback goes from negative to positive. Now, a positive feedback sounds good, but it's the worst thing of all, because positive is meant in this sense self-reinforcing. So the nightmare, for example, from a scientific perspective is, what if the oceans come to a point where they can no longer take up carbon dioxide and suddenly starts emitting carbon dioxide instead? What's the point where the Amazon rainforest, instead of being one of the world's largest carbon sinks, crosses a threshold and becomes a carbon source? So suddenly it doesn't matter if you and I emit carbon dioxide, Mother Earth takes over and self-reinforces warming. And that's what causes a tipping point. So we're quite good today to say we know quite well what are the processes that creates these feedbacks, for example, carbon sinks. And what we're looking for is the point at which these feedbacks change direction. And that is a very deep insight for everything we talk about in terms of economic development or governance or policy, because we've built up our economic system on the assumption that we are here, and then we want to see how we can in the with the least marginal costs take us to this optimized point. And at this optimized point, the marginal cost will exceed marginal benefits, so we try to deviate from that point. Now with this insight of feedback changes, the point where you want to stop might be much earlier, or is likely to be much earlier, because the point of concern is not the tipping point. The point of concern is where the feedback starts changing direction and uncontrolled processes take over. Another very prominent and important example is ice melt.
Right.
So, the polar regions, the inland glaciers are permanent ice sheets. Now these are permanent ice sheets which, apart from storing huge amounts of water in the form of ice, are also white surfaces. And these white surfaces reflect back 80–90% of incoming heat from the sun back to space. So they're planetary cooling systems. And we know now that these cooling systems are absolutely critical to keep the planet in a desired state to support human development. Now when ice melts, in the beginning they remain white surfaces. In fact, it's a negative feedback because you melt ice, it consumes energy. So it's actually a way of dampening our warming. But you come to a point beyond which suddenly entire surfaces are liquid surfaces, and a liquid surface is darker than a white surface. So suddenly you cross a tipping point when the ice no longer is a net cooler, it becomes a net heater because it starts absorbing more heat than it reflects back to space.
Right.
And then suddenly Greenland turns from being a cooling system to being a heating system. And then it takes over and you go from negative to positive feedbacks. So that is at heart how resilience theory informs planetary boundary framework. In fact, you need to understand resilience, i.e. the risk of shifts and feedbacks and tipping points, to be able at all to define the boundaries.
Right. Well, and I wonder if we could maybe talk a little bit about timelines. And in some of your work, you've talked about the 1950s as being a critical point in this process, and really arguably the beginning of what you've called the Great Acceleration, and I love how you've described it as a hockey stick, which is, I think, something all Canadians will immediately understand. What happened in the 1950s that is so important?
Well, this is quite a remarkable advancement of our empirical observations of our relationship between the world and Earth, that up until the mid-1950s, you can pick any hockey stick you want, meaning any process in the planet that matters for human well-being, be it deforestation or air pollution or emission of greenhouse gases. Up until the mid-1950s, we actually had a very, very small impact on the planetary system. So if you think of it in terms of a plot, and you plot it from the 1750 when the Industrial Revolution started up until the mid-1950s, the lines, they do increase, but very slowly, with regards to air pollution, deforestation, freshwater use, climate change. They all change very, very gently.
Right.
I.e., we have very limited, if zero, impact on the planet as a whole. Then in the mid-1950s, 10 years after the Second World War, something dramatic happens. We're 3.5 billion people, and the stability in the world economy 10 years after the Second World War and the breakthroughs in the modern industrialization means that we suddenly go to scale with the modern industrial metabolism, which means that you see an exponential rise in the human pressures on the planet. And these look exactly like hockey sticks. And we've all become familiar with one hockey stick, which is the emission of greenhouse gases.
Right.
But I can tell you they look exactly the same for essentially every parameter from the Earth system that matters for human well-being and economic development. So it means that we now know that in the mid-1950s, something dramatic happens, which we have baptized the moment of the Great Acceleration, which is the moment when we exponentially increase our pressures on the planet. And this is the moment beyond which we really start increasing and having influence at the planetary scale. But it's not until sometime in the late 1980s, early 1990s, that we start seeing that the planet becomes, so to say, to put it in simple words, it's like entering a boxing ring and you have two boxers fighting, and the fight starts in mid-1955. And the Earth system gets one punch after the other, but it's not until the late 1980s that the planet seems to fall down on the floor for the first time,
Right.
and start sending invoices back to the economy. So up until that point, at late 1980s, you could talk of a small world on a big planet, meaning that even though we, were unsustainable on so many fronts, we expanded agriculture and cut down forests. We entered the sixth mass extinction of species. We overfished the oceans. We emitted greenhouse gases. We were still a relatively small world on a large planet. Mother Earth had ample, space
Right.
to absorb these disturbances. There was enough atmosphere to take carbon dioxide. There was enough oceans to take overfishing. But from 1990s onwards, we seem to have reached a saturation point. We tip over and become a relatively large world on a small planet. And this is the point when we start seeing the first invoices sent back. And we see these as observations. So the collapse of the cod fisheries
Right.
outside of Newfoundland is one such example. You see the first examples of tipping points in lake systems. You see the Baltic Sea, the world's largest inland sea, to tip over from a cod-rich to an over-polluted state. We pass the boundary on climate, so we saturate the climate system to a point where we start seeing the acceleration of melting of ice in the Arctic. So we see these first signs of hitbacks, and it's then some 10 years later that we start seeing the first evidence, for example, of heat waves that cannot be explained without incorporating human-induced climate change, hitting in a big way. So 2003, the first massive heat wave hits Europe,
Right.
killing 50 to 70,000 people, the largest environmental disaster, in fact the largest social disaster since the Second World War in Europe. And science clearly showing that that heat wave is such a large outlier that it's difficult to decouple from the fact that we warmed the planet with roughly 1 degree Celsius. So the interesting thing, so in summary, the story goes, up until mid-1950s, we are having very limited impact on the planet. We enter the Great Acceleration, and we have this last period of forgiveness from the planet up until the mid-1980s, late 1980s. And from then on, we are in the saturated phase of a fully globalized world, also in terms of environmental pressures. And it's this last 20 years that science increasingly shows that we need to change the paradigm. And that paradigm has to shift from this belief that we can have economic growth and try to just reduce environmental impacts as far as we can, which actually fundamentally assumes that the planet has this infinite ability to take abuse.
Right.
To a new paradigm where we say we need to set planetary boundaries based on the best science on the point beyond which the planet will start sending, big costs, social and economic costs back to the economy, and instead have development within that safe operating space. So it's and I'm often trying to emphasize this story for the following reason. We tend to do two mistakes. One mistake is that we tend to say, oh, but you environmental scientists have been warning for 50 years. And you've been shouting wolf so many times, so why should we believe you now?
Right.
They refer back to the Limits to Growth report in the 70s. Rachel Carson, for heaven's sake, she wrote her book, Silent Spring, in 1962. And my answer is, well, yes, these were early warnings, very early insightful warnings,
Right.
because they had no evidence from the curves. The curves were still, they had barely started to bend. It is not until today we're at the top of these hockey sticks. And these hockey sticks are actually not models or theories or hypotheses. These are observations.
Right.
So we are now, you and I are now the first generation to know that we are really at this saturated point. So it's a false critique to say that we've been warning for so long. In fact, the first synthesis of the multiple hockey sticks came out in 2007.
Okay.
And it's only in the last 20 years that we start seeing the first empirical evidence of invoices being sent back. So it's a very new piece of science. And the second mistake we tend to do is to say, well, the environmental impacts that we are causing will give, just incremental costs back to society. So we can deal with it through just economic policy, because you just get the price right on the market, then we will be able to sort ourselves out when the costs increase. Well, that doesn't work any longer, because the growing evidence that we have the risk of abrupt changes that could be catastrophic means that you go from predictable costs to infinite cost.
Right.
And infinite cost cannot be dealt very easily through markets. In fact, you go outside of the realm of economics, in my mind, into the realm of ethics. You enter the realm where you need to simply start thinking of regulatory measures. So beyond a certain point of climate emissions, where you go beyond 2 degrees Celsius, for example, in terms of warming, you have so high likelihood of catastrophic impacts, of irreversible sea level rise exceeding meters, which would, undermine hundreds of millions of people from Bangladesh to even coastlines in Europe and
Right.
North America, that you end up in a situation where you simply need to collectively, as a world community, start addressing these issues in a very serious way. So it changes the agenda.
Right. Well, and perhaps we could talk a little bit about the social implications of all of this. And you've talked about social ecological turbulence. What do you mean by that, and where are we seeing this today?
Well, I think most people recognize that we've entered the globalized phase of communications, the
Right.
globalized phase of financial transaction, the globalized phase of economics, the globalized phase of trade, and now we've entered the globalized phase of environmental change. And not surprisingly, these things interact, and they interact in real time at a large scale. But it's only in the last 10 years we're starting to see the first tentative evidence that they really lead to knock-on effects on societies, which I would call turbulence. So the prime example is the Arab Spring, where you see a very important evolution. I mean, there's no doubt to anyone that this was a social uprising from a new generation of well-connected youth who were rising against decades of dictatorial rule. There's no doubt that it was triggered by the self-immolation of a vegetable vendor in Tunis, which kind of was a spark,
Right.
no doubt. But what's interesting and significant is that 2 years before this ignite occurred in Tunis, the phosphorus prices on the world market rose by not 100, not 200, but 350%.
Right.
And phosphorus happens to be the most important fertilizer for the modern agricultural system. And exactly at the same time, President Putin in Russia shut down the export borders on cereals because he had the most unprecedented forest fires in Russian modern history. And at the same time, Prime Minister Rudd in Australia shut down the Australian export borders on cereals because of 12 years of unprecedented droughts in Australia. And this led to such a volatility on the world food market that it led to exponential rise in food prices, which in turn led to food riots in the large capital cities from Cairo to Tunis. So this occurred at the same time as this social uprising. And there is increasing scientific literature coming out indicating that that collision of this ecological shock through phosphorus price rises and climate change induced shifts in the world food market interacted with this social disruption
Right.
to cause and get the Arab Spring to scale. Basically saying that if it hadn't been for the social movement and the food riots related to ecological change, it would have been difficult to get the Arab Spring to scale. And this could be the first ever example in even in human history on Earth, of a social ecological collision leading to nation scale instability, meaning the first example of social ecological turbulence. Another example that is also being increasingly supported through scientific evidence is that in the 4 years running up to the Syrian war, we know as a fact probably is the 4 worst consecutive drought years
Right.
ever recorded in the Iranian entire Tigris region, which after all is the very origin of the agricultural revolution 8,000 years back in the Mesopotamian agricultural revolution, which means that we know that these 4 years running up to the Syrian war also led to a huge migration of farmers from rural areas into cities like Damascus and Aleppo. 2 million people are estimated to have been forced into urban areas to the point actually that the Assad regime went out with even official statements of nervousness of what kind of impacts this would have on the stability in the nation. And then, bang, you have a war causing the enormous catastrophe for humans that we see playing out today. Incredibly difficult, of course, of proving any causality. Very difficult to say what impact this climate change induced rural migration to cities had. But it's very difficult also to decouple it. It's very difficult to say that that instability caused by environmental change, and again, I should emphasize that this drought is impossible to decouple from human-induced climate change. So you have human-induced climate change playing with a drought that probably would have occurred, but the amplitude of it was amplified by, is amplified by climate change, which in turn causes social effects, which could interplay with the social disruption of the war that broke out. So these are just, you know, even though there's a very healthy academic debate around this, even though I totally agree that it's difficult, you can even call it just putative evidence at this stage, but there is a systemic direction of the evidence that in the Anthropocene, with the globalization of our social, economic, financial, and environmental changes, are starting, not surprisingly, to see social ecological turbulence occurring at a large scale, which we have not seen before.
Right. Now we've got 2 or 3 minutes left. What do you want your readers to take away from your book?
Yeah, so the new book, Big World, Small Planet, Abundance Within Planetary Boundaries, is an effort of putting the state of knowledge around the Anthropocene, around global risks, around the need for a transition into a safe operating space in the context of opportunity. So it tells the story of how these insights of you know, almost existential risk can be transformed into being used as the most important incentive for huge innovations into a transformation to a desirable future. And we're laying out the story that there's such a large, well-justified enthusiasm over, you know, going to scale with our digital revolution, about nanotechnology, biotechnology, huge opportunities of transformation energy systems into a solar, wind, biomass, hydro powered world economy, an enormous opportunity around hydro fuel cells, and also about breakthroughs in battery technologies and solar voltaics going to scale thanks to, you know, grid parity across the world. So we're in a situation of enormous opportunity in disruptive technologies and exponential rise in breakthroughs on technology, which can benefit humanity, but probably only if we also set the boundaries within which those innovations can operate.
Right.
Because otherwise we risk doing what we've seen in the past, where big technological breakthroughs help human well-being on the short term, but actually has rebound effects, just accelerating ourselves into a journey of unsustainability. But what if we now can, for the first time, bound innovation to occur within a safe operating space and have abundance within a stable planet? That's the story in this book. And it's a story, therefore, of hope, but it's a story of two communities colliding, the sustainability crowd and the innovation crowd, into a kind of a new paradigm for development. And that's what I hope that this book can convey. And it conveys it in a way that I think is quite new, which is it combines the language of science with the language of photography and storytelling. So it tries to you know, communicate both to heart and brain in telling that story.
Right. Johan, this has been absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us, and congratulations on the book.
Okay, thanks a lot.
And thank you to our audience. You have been watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us online at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Twitter.